have Dave Bona and Theresa Untering, I hope I got that right, and Jenny Migneault. Thank you. We're going to start with our testimony with Mr. Bona, and then we'll step to Jenny and go from there. Dave, the floor is yours.
Hello. I'm just going to explain what I've been doing since the last time I testified. Directly as a result of the media attention I received from the last time I testified, a lot of people have been reaching out to me. In this past year and a bit, I've talked to well over 100 veterans and civilians from not just Canada, but the States, Australia, Ireland, England, New Zealand. And what has emerged, there's an actual pattern to the injury from those who've been poisoned by Mefloquine. The first and foremost being is that they have PTSD that is resistant to treatment. Second being is they have gut issues, balance and dizziness issues, tinnitus, body temperature regulation issues, numbness and tingling in the extremities, sensitivity to light, and extreme difficulty in moderating moods. And all these injuries are indicative of a brain stem injury. Now, what we found is the majority of these individuals, because the nature of the injury is degenerative, a lot of their severe symptoms are not becoming apparent until, if they're not identified early on in their career and medically released, post-release, a lot of their symptoms are manifesting in extreme ways that basically prevent them from accessing even basic health care. Like, I'll use Claude as an example. He has severe difficulty moderating his moods. And that difficulty moderating his moods, like he cannot even be in a crowded, busy doctor's office. Like he's unable to access basic Veterans Affairs services because of the nature of the injury from the Mefloquine, because he gets worked up around a lot of people. And then by the time he gets into the doctor, he's not able to articulate what his needs are because he's so worked up. And if the doctor is very contrary and is not open to suggestion on what possibly could be wrong with Claude, and he recommends that Claude, do neuropsychiatric medication or go see a psychiatrist or something like this, Claude would get really worked up. And I also had this problem. Like I fired up to, I think, 5 family doctors because they tried to push medications at me. They tried to do the neuropsychiatric thing. And I finally found a doctor who can actually do the paperwork and would listen to what I was saying. So this injury is part and parcel of this whole transition. Like we've poisoned well over, probably, we've given this drug to 40,000 Canadian soldiers. And a lot of the studies are indicating up to 74% of those people who have taken this drug are actually injured by this drug. And an example of that being one of our strongest civilian advocates who committed suicide January 2nd. She reached out to me in the past because she was severely struggling with severe depression associated with Mefloquine poisoning. And she constantly asked me how I was able to keep my head above water, how I was able to keep moving forward. She didn't quite make it, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So we'll start with our first round of 3 minutes, Mr. Kitchen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, and good to see you again, Dave. Thank you for coming.
Jenny, I apologize.
I'm used to it.
We'll reel that back in.
I'm
Strike
used
the minutes on that, and we'll start with our testimony.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know, buddy. Yeah.
I'm being ignored again.
Don't follow my dance step. So, Jenny, welcome here, and I do apologize. The floor is yours.
Thank you for this opportunity to be heard.
That's the first time I've ever on that, so I apologize.
As a vet spouse and a caregiver, I used to feel that I was nothing. But because the parliamentary system has turned our veterans and their families into political issues and is treating them as such, I've become a jack of all trades of advocacy. I'm here today as representing myself, although I am a member of the VAC Family Advisory Committee. I'm also a blogger on 45enord.ca, a public speaker, an advocate in English, and a militante in French. I support, defend, promote, attack causes rather than people, GPSU, medical cannabis, caregiving, PTSD, and political situation of caregivers, all topics that have a connection or impacts on families. Since my chase after ex-Minister Fantino in 2014, my life is not the same. I'm now a grandmother. My ex-husband and I are divorced, and in some ways, I am still his caregiver. Following our separation, like many vet spouses I know, unfortunately, I became homeless myself. So I made the decision to live in my car and to do a cross-country tour from Newfoundland to Vancouver Island. For 6 months, I met people, visited organizations, etc., allowing me to start my own healing process and develop a much wider perspective about the many challenges veterans and their families are confronted to, culturally, socially, and geographically speaking. Finally, I'm now sharing my life with a veteran, also with PTSD, whose last name is, believe it or not, Fantini. I'm still a vet spouse and a caregiver. The transitioning process never ends because they never become civilians again. A caregiver can be the best ally or the worst enemy to someone who's suffering. The political battle of families and caregivers is about having their identity valued and their dignity respected through support, financial recognition, and education. The collective efforts of the past few years generated a political love and a national recognition that was felt all over the country. A VAC Family Committee was created. More programs dedicated to families, including children, the forgotten of the forgotten, do I have to say it, were developed. Books were published. MFRCs became more accessible. More research was done on caregivers, who were also, generally speaking, more included, for instance, at the OSI clinics. Because we were heard, we became better caregivers, still a lot of work to be done, but also we were able to better protect ourselves and our families from the collateral damage. So the new measure that will take place this April, allowing a caregiver to receive $1,000 to his or her own name, is a major political win on paper. It's a positive game changer for many families if it's accessible. So in the end, veterans and their families share the most important barrier preventing them from positively moving forward. The barrier is VAC, with its own bureaucratic and schizophrenic way to love. For example, medical cannabis, a medication. On one hand, VAC makes it available, and for at least 7,000 veterans in this country, it seems to be working. Well, on the other hand, VAC penalizes the veterans and their families with decisions that are truly hurting, with no consideration for the pain, the impacts on the quality of life, and the cost they have to pay for their medication. Do you realize that on top of fighting the process, everything that concerns the process of the exemption letters for medical cannabis is a shame? Do you realize that on top on finding the one person among the 3-4 Canadians who can actually, satisfy Veterans Affairs by writing an exemption letter, well, on top of it, okay, you have to fulfill the ridiculous and complicated requirements. And this veteran, after providing all the paperwork, will still have to wait between 3 to 6 months before he receives his approval. So, in the meantime, some veterans pay more than $1,000 monthly to be able to have their medication that was prescribed and that they need. Do you think that's complicated like that with pills? The answer is no. So, behind each delay, deny, and die, there is a name. Okay? For each file, there is a person who has a power to make time either a powerful healer or a very silent killer. So who should be held accountable for the pain that shouldn't be? VAC as an identity or the people that come here at every parliamentary session to tell you what you want to hear? To be honest, I don't think you realize the power that one single person working for VAC can have on a veteran's life and his family. Sometimes the barriers are closer to home than we think. So, and the situations keeps being ignored. For example, and I'll give you one, the OSI clinics in Montreal and Quebec are known, okay, to penalize veterans who choose medical cannabis. Okay, veterans will be kicked out of the clinic with no resources, and in some cases, their driver's license will be revoked. I mean, I've heard, and I know at least 17 of them. There is a problem there. So, who will stand up for those veterans? Huh? Do anybody care about their transitioning? Because medical cannabis works for them. And yet, the system, within the system, are penalizing all of them. Well, you know what? Anyway, psychiatrists are untouchable in this matter. 2 weeks ago, I represented a veteran at his first appeal for his sleep apnea at the VRAB. Okay, so I represented a veteran. To make a long story short, the veteran had to wait 5 years before he was able to gather all the paperwork, okay, to prove his condition. You know, you have to wait the provincial health system to be tested 5 years. So in 2016, the VAC pension agent received all the paperwork proving the existence of the condition and the confirmation of 2 doctors, okay, that made the connection between the sleep apnea and the PTSD. Well, the VAC pension agent didn't seem to think that it was enough because she had to ask, on top of it, a medical consultant hired by VAC. And what do you think this person said? Well, of course, it's not related. Well, after I'm done speaking, I will share with you, okay, the decision because I have it. This single decision made by a medical consultant who never met the client, okay, that person has a lot of power because it means years of waiting for a veteran to fight a ridiculous system that doesn't make sense. And would you tell me why Veterans Affairs requires that a veteran who wants to have an exemption letter meet face-to-face with the specialist, and yeah, they can ask a medical consultant who never meets the veteran their opinion, and that's good enough. This is schizophrenic, okay? So, sometimes, finally, because I only had 5 minutes, sometimes the barrier also comes from the provinces, okay? And I know you don't have much power, but you know, in Quebec, things are very particular sometimes when it comes to our veterans. So, for instance, recently, a veteran won a legal battle against Revenu Québec, which is not respecting the Canadian law that was proving by forcing a certain category of veterans to pay public insurance plan for prescription drugs. In fact, to this day, Revenu Québec still doesn't care about the judgment. Who will stand up for the veterans of Quebec who are concerned? Once again, I provided you with the paper. I'm going to give you 2 things. In fact, an article I wrote about this veteran and also an article that was published last December. Okay, it's about the psychiatrist of the OSI clinic of Quebec who says very openly that they are against medical cannabis. So, barriers are mostly political, if you ask me, when it comes to transitioning. And there are countless stories that keeps coming my way. Dave keeps hearing them every day, I'm sure. And 5 minutes is not enough to talk about the barriers. Thank you.
Mr. Kitchen, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and we'll try this again. Dave and Jenny, thank you for, and Theresa.
Is Theresa going to talk?
Testimony-wise, I believe it was just one. If she would, I could stick it in if you had a few minutes, if the committee's fine with that. Yep, okay, Theresa, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I looked at the wording in the format of today's gatherings, specifically obstacles to the smooth transition of veterans to civilian life. And for so many hundreds and thousands of veterans, I believe there are two pertinent answers to that. Firstly, and most importantly, appropriate diagnosis, and secondly, stigma. PTSD is very real, it's manageable with treatment, and the outcomes can be positive. But I believe we have an epidemic of misdiagnosis. For Dave and the majority of members who served for Canada that were exposed to the drug Mefloquine and poisoned by it have varying degrees of damage to their brains, acquired brain injuries, not just PTSD. And the results of this are in mental and physical symptoms. Had Dave been appropriately diagnosed at the time of his release almost 20 years ago, I can only imagine how different our lives could have been, how much better our lives could have been. Even without appropriate treatment at that time, at least there would have been a starting point. At least there would have been an acknowledging of the underlying issue that was preventing his progress with standard treatment for PTSD. This brings me to the point where stigma becomes a barrier. 20 years ago, I believe there was complicity in the desire to cover up the harmful effects of this drug, Mefloquine, beginning with the botched drug trial in Somalia, and then the subsequent order to halt the Somalia inquiry. The shame went unchecked for this group of veterans, and for the most part continues today. And now, if it's not suppression of information and outright denial, then it certainly is in such an absence of acknowledgement that you can hear the crickets singing in the silence. This feeds into stigma and creates its own impediment to successful treatment. I want this government to acknowledge the damage this drug has caused, because this trickles down to affect appropriate diagnosis by the medical community in general. As a spouse of a veteran, my life has been seriously impacted by Dave's mental health, I have stood by feeling helpless at times as Dave behaved uncontrollably in ways that ended possible career futures for him. And this is due to his it was unpredictable and seemingly spontaneous episodes of rage and anger. And the best way that I can describe it, it's like a parallel of reality that he would slip into. I have watched him gather all of his emotional might and force himself to try again and again and again. Physical symptoms were and are such a serious barrier as well, such as gut issues. Having diarrhea greatly impacts your ability to work on a daily regimen, and it impedes normal day-to-day functioning. Dizziness and vertigo is not only inconvenient, but downright dangerous in certain work situations. And for myself, where to begin? I must admit, it's very hard for me to be here. I have given up my life and the majority of my dreams. I gave up many opportunities for careers myself because I couldn't leave Dave alone with our twins for more than a couple of hours at a time. I didn't know that his disability would be that impactful on my life. And that feeds into my own personal sense of shame and stigma because I haven't had a career. I've tried many, and they've had to be halted at many different intervals throughout the last 15 years that we've been together. This is an outward rippling of the effect of the damage that this drug has caused and affected us. I think it's time to recognize Mefloquine poisoning and the resultant damage as a significant barrier to smooth transition. There is hope for members of our forces and veterans who have been impacted by exposure to this drug. There are therapies showing considerable promise that greatly reduce the mental and physical side effects of the damage from this drug. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kitchen, 3 minutes.
Okay, we're good? Okay. All right. Let's try this one more time. Theresa, Dave, Jenny, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate that. And I thank you for having you come and for on the committee before. Dave, we've talked in times gone by, and you know, since that conversation, I've actually learned that of my children who love to travel, and they've got that travel bug. My oldest son informed me that he was taking Mefloquine, he did not tell me that till just the other day, and was telling me how he stopped taking it because he started getting these weird dreams and nightmares. And I'm so glad to hear him saying that. And obviously, I have an opportunity possibly to go to Pakistan in the next little while. And when I was there as a child, the medication we had for malaria was different. Definitely, if they offer me Mefloquine, it's not even an option as far as I'm concerned. But we know the impact that it's had on your life. It's had a tremendous amount, and you've relayed that to us. This discussion is about transition, and we've heard from the ombudsman basically saying that we've studied this to death, and nothing's come out of it. And we've come up with all sorts of recommendations, and nothing's been done about them. And I know when we first started, I talked about the issue of, okay, let's take a look at the transitions that we've had or what we've recommended, and have they actually been done? Can you describe to us your transition as you relay from when you transitioned as much as you can?
You really want me to do that?
Yes, please.
On the record.
I was court-martialed and kicked out. I was given a 5F release, the bad one. The individual that was responsible for that was Colonel Jorgensen. He's now General Jorgensen works at VA. I had the unit padre trying to stand up for me, going, I even heard him, I was on the duty desk, he was yelling at the colonel in his office, listen, he has PTSD, and Jorgen yelling back, no, he doesn't, he's a discipline problem. My transition was, there's the gate, load 14 years of your life into a old clapped out Toyota Tercel, and don't let the gate hit you in the ass on the way out. I came out, the only reason I'm alive is I was one of OSIS's first clients. They actually, I'm here because of them. And yeah, my transition, I don't know why I don't know why I'm here actually, other than OSIS stepping in, because yeah.
You found OSIS to be very effective in...
Originally, OSIS was an entity unto itself. It's now been taken over by Veterans Affairs, and its mandate is directed by Veterans Affairs. OSIS at one time had its own budget. OSIS was extremely effective back then at saving lives. Now it's handcuffed by Veterans Affairs. I'll give you an example of how effective OSIS was. I was literally living in my mom and dad's basement. I could not interact with the public. I was completely non-functional. They facilitated me getting in to see a psychologist that specialized in military trauma. They facilitated my paperwork with Veterans Affairs. A year later, when I was able and trying to go to school, they facilitated that. There was no red tape. I didn't have to phone the March of Dimes. I didn't have to phone the Legion asking for handouts and anything. If I needed something, they supplied it. And there was no questions asked. There was no 50 forms to fill out, no doctor referral. I would like to go to school. What do you want to do? Well, I've got to go redo my grade 12. Well,
For that,
I'm sorry.
Mr. Bertina.
Thank you all. It's quite some testimony we're hearing. Jenny, if I may go to you first. What concerns do you have about the caregiver allowance that we're going to be bringing forward, the $1,000 a month? I'm sensing that you're still caregiving someone, but two now, but you may not be eligible. Is that what are your concerns about, or do you have a concern? Do you think it's just a good thing, or are you waiting to see how it rolls out?
You see, it doesn't concern me personally anymore because my spouse is with the old system. Okay, he's going to be the one receiving $600 for me. Okay, I won't have access to anything. I am represented by an amount, but he will receive it for me. What's fantastic with the $1,000 it's that it's given directly to the caregiver. Okay, and when I say it's going to be a game changer. It has the possibility because, you know, when someone is not doing well and has all the power, the financial power, many spouses are left with nothing. Okay, when things go bad and he decides that, you know, he's going to buy an RV or whatever you want, okay, sometimes the end of the months are very tough. So this will make a difference. It's not only in terms of dignity, it's also in terms of identity. Now, what will be the criteria to access it? Okay, this is the core of the war. Because everything is related to physical injuries. Listen, if your spouse is in bed, no arms, no legs, can't walk, can't talk, can't eat, no problem. You will have that money if it's enough. But if he has PTSD, depression, social anxiety. I mean, Theresa mentioned and she was right. Okay, the problem is with the diagnosis, of course, but the criterias. This system does not recognize a mental wound. Okay, so I mean, how can you justify to a system that you are needed when he has his both hands and for you, he can cook his supper? Me, I know he can't do it. If I don't do it, he won't eat. If I don't clean the house, he won't clean because the depression, the pills, the medication, you name it, is keeping him sitting on the bench. Won't do nothing. He can't. So accessing this money, I feel that it will be a challenge. Not to mention that I am certain that this country doesn't even know how many caregivers Veterans Affairs is taking care of. Okay, we don't know the numbers. 200,000 clients with Veterans Affairs, I say there's 200,000 caregivers. Can we afford to pay each caregiver that lives at home, takes care, who deserves that money? Can we afford it? I don't think so.
Mr. Johns.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with Dave. Well, thank you all, first of all, for your testimony and sharing your personal experiences with us. It's so important, and sorry that you're having to live through this difficult challenge. My colleague Aaron Matheson asked Minister O'Regan in the House in September of last year to initiate a study to determine the long-term neurotoxicology of the Mefloquine. So maybe, Dave, what is your opinion? Do you think that a committee study on the specific issue of Mefloquine would be beneficial to your cause? And
I have no faith in the government actually stepping up and acknowledging this. I've actually had to write that off. My sole focus is reaching veterans individually. Like, we've been talking about transition for 10 years, and the reports are tabled you can pull it out of the archives. A friend of mine did, and it's the same thing over and over and over again. And is Mefloquine going to be any different? No, it's not. Look at the Agent Orange fiasco. How many years did it take the government to pony up to help these guys? Oh, yeah, living with a life of cancer, unable to work, unable to do anything, not able to have a family. That was worth, what, $23,000 was the average payout? I have no faith in the government acknowledging this or doing anything about this. A study? Yeah, another study so they can order another study, can do another study.
okay, then in your discussions with veterans from other countries, and I know you've had these conversations, and have you noticed if some countries have a better method of treating survivors of Mefloquine?
No, every country in the Western world is balking at this because of the financial cost of the extended health care associated with people that have been poisoned by Mefloquine.
Okay. What can we do better then in terms of dealing with it, in terms of what would you
One
like to see?
thing, we need someone to stand up in the House and say, we may have poisoned our soldiers. That's it. And then what'll happen from there is the provincial healthcare systems, the funding agencies for research, because right now, funding agencies will not give money to any Mefloquine research because they don't want to go against the government and get their funding cut. That is the problem. We just need one individual say, we may have poisoned our soldiers. That's it.
Thank you. That's important. Question, and I think it can be either Jenny or Theresa can answer this. Does the proposed caregiver amount go far enough? I mean, you've outlined the load that you're carrying, and it's significant. Maybe if you just want to elaborate a little bit on that, if you could.
Theresa, you want to go?
Oh, yeah. It's interesting. It sounds nice. Like the thought of having $1,000 a month would be nice. Will I be eligible for it? I don't know. He looks capable. You know, does it take care of the last 15 years of my life that I've given up? You know, does it attend to that? I'm not sure. You know, I'm not sure. I don't know how to respond to that. Like it's such a large impact, and yet it's the offer of the $1,000 is good, but is it enough? I don't know.
Can I?
Is it is accessible? And like I don't know if I'll be able to even access it.
If you could just end quickly on this, and we'll.
If I may, it's not a paycheck. It's a compensation, sort of. So that does not replace anything that is lost. And let's not forget that with the new veteran charter, okay, like my ex-husband is, okay, I was penalized compared to the old pension. And since I had to quit my job, okay, at least $12,000, that's not enough. But that's a good start. Okay? It's not a salary replacement.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you all very much for being here. Much appreciated. I'd like to ask you, Jenny, with regard to, and you talked a little bit about the importance of having the family involved in a transition and talked about some of the specifics. What other specific things do you think this committee could recommend to the government to support families of medically releasing veterans in particular, so that we can support the families who are doing the important and vital work for a successful transition? What can we do?
Ground zero is the Canadian Armed Forces. I believe you heard Barry Westholm here, okay? And he defends also the family. I've experienced when I advocated for a case in Comox, how I was welcome in a JPSU. As a family member, they did know who I was, to see how I was treated. But more importantly, okay, the message is ground zero is the Canadian Armed Forces. Families are coming out of the service already wounded. Okay, they are already wounded. So does that answer your question, actually? Because it starts from there, and then the inclusion, okay, when you combine sort of the fact that we are excluded, okay, medically speaking, it can be understandable, but in the end, we're not educated. Our biggest problem, okay, is the lack of education and support. So right now, as a spouse, I can have access to a number of meetings with a psychologist. That's a good start again. Not enough. And once again, one of the problem is if the veteran doesn't ask for his spouse, the spouse cannot access that help. Once again, identity and dignity. Okay, this is the core. Help me protect myself and protect the family. Help me be a better caregiver, and I will provide for the wounded a better environment to give him the motivation, okay, to fight whatever he has to fight in order for him to have a quality of life. The biggest problem is right here. Okay? It's right here. They are left alone. They don't fit in society anymore. Their wives go and leave them. I mean, they end up alone. They have all the troubles accessing a service dogs. And, you know, it becomes very complicated at every single level. We are there, okay, to compensate on many levels, and also we're the only person who truly knows the person they are inside and still fight for them. We are part of this dynamic, and we need to have, not just to be good, because we are part of the solution.
I couldn't agree more, Jenny, and that's very well put. I'd like to hear Dave and Theresa on that point with regard to involving the family, supporting the caregivers and family members to ensure a successful transition. Do you have specific things that we could recommend to the government with regard to those supports on the ground and in place? Do you have any comments on that?
Just to reiterate what Jenny said, it's accessibility. Even until she said it, I don't even think about it. I thought to myself, I could really use some counseling, but I had to go through Dave to ask for it. And it wasn't until she just said it. Now it's yeah, that's actually affects my dignity as a person. I can't even go to Veterans Affairs and say, okay, I need counseling, I need help. And it has to be through him. And what if he's really mad at me? Or what if he's off on one of the tangents that sometimes takes a week or two for him to recover? I have no accessibility. None.
Thanks very much.
So we're going to have just 2-minute rounds each for 3 rounds, and we'll go with Mr. Yolfison.
I'm going to be giving my time to Ms. Romanata.
Okay.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being here. Many people who know me know that the reason I decided to run for office is I found that military and veteran families like mine, I have 2 sons serving, didn't have a voice. And so I'm happy to have you here and telling your story, because I think that's one that needs to be told, is how military service and after service affects families. And thank you for giving families like mine a voice. Speaking of families, because of course that's something that's near and dear to me, I know that if I go to an MFRC, my sons are serving, I can get services. There's a lot that still needs to be done, and I know that if I were to walk into an MFRC, if I was a veteran or a veteran family, they would probably still serve me. They would just do it. Because why? When you're a member of the military, you're always a member of the military and you're a family. I'd like to get your opinion a little bit about how giving that access to veterans post transition and their families to go to the MFRCs, to continue that relationship, how will that help? We've heard about the caregiver benefit, but also with respect to the MFRCs, and I find that they have such a crucial role. Do you think that it will help by letting families to continue to have access to them, if that would be helpful?
I apologize. We're down to about 30 seconds, Jenny, on the answer on that.
Yes, but don't forget that the MFRCs experience challenges of their own also. The Canadian Armed Forces right now are putting a lot of efforts, okay, to have much control over the MFRCs, okay? Please get them out of there. Families, okay, know what they need, know what they want, and they can rule their MFRCs.
And I stress to all 3 of you is if there's anything you want to add to your testimony, get it in a written brief, and we'll get it to the committee, and I do apologize. Ms. Wagon. Oh.
Thank you. Appreciate you all, Dave, Jenny, and Theresa, for being here. Dave, this Mefloquine issue is not going away.
No, it's actually a degenerative issue, and the people are getting iller,
Right.
sicker, the longer.
I'm saying it's not going away in the eyes of Canadians. It's growing as an issue for
Yes.
how we've treated our veterans, how we've treated our soldiers, and
Yes.
continue to. It's now a drug of last resort, finally announced by the Surgeon General as we were going into our summer break. However, it's still available to Canadians.
Yes.
There's been no change there. And Bev, who we both knew, and I'm still dealing with that. And of course, I have nowhere to go to affirm this, but she said to me, Kathy, I have a friend who's a case manager. They were told to their faces, do not bring up Mefloquine with your clients. Okay, so this, do you want to say anything to that mindset, I guess, within VAC and within government?
What we're running into is Mefloquine doesn't neatly fall into a box. It actually straddles like 4 or 5 different diagnoses. Veterans Affairs doesn't like that. They like their nice little tidy boxes. This is the same issue that we had with PTSD and Agent Orange, where the driver for change was actually the veterans. And that's what we're doing now. We're defining the injury, just like they did with PTSD way back when. A bunch of Vietnam vets sitting around the VA, this is what I'm having. Another guy, well, I got the same problem, and then a doctor going, oh, well, that's a pattern. Well, we've now identified that pattern, just like they have done.
Thank you. Jenny, you mentioned the issues with the OSI in Quebec, and I've heard this firsthand, how if you need the help and you go for the help, you cannot get services if you're functioning on medical cannabis versus pharmaceuticals. We know pharmaceutical companies now are desperately looking for an alternative version of cannabis so that they can be part of that market. So just some feedback from you on that.
That's ridiculous. Okay, it's all about money and power once again. Why can this country accept that ginger will help you ease your stomach, but medical cannabis is seen and it's continued to be seen and perceived as a drug? Okay, and that's the core of the problem. The problem is nobody accepts it. Okay, especially in Quebec. The stigmas over there are so strong, it's penalizing them. And do anybody worry why in Quebec City there were like 20 suicides in just a year or two? There's a reason for that, and I'll believe that all players have a responsibility in those deaths. And maybe that for some of them, they were kicked out of a clinic and left with no resources because of a choice they made.
So we'll end with Mr. Poisson.
Oui, Madame Migneault, vous avez parlé.
Madame Migneault, you spoke of Quebec, the situation in Quebec, but throughout the other provinces, it does vary from province to province, I suppose. Well, Quebec, I guess, particularly different, if you will, but what's the situation elsewhere? Well, look, for Quebec, in Quebec alone, if you see a white poppy on top of a red poppy at the National Assembly, I mean, you talk about the unique situation of each province. In Newfoundland, the culture there, people know each other pretty well, and you know what they do? They hide the homelessness. Nobody goes to shelters. They couch surf. Everybody knows each other. They're ready to help each other, and they're masking a social problem. Newfoundland, there was a veteran who was found 4 months after he died in his own home. So every province has some unique cultural features that, different attitudes. We have the Vandus in Quebec. That's our iconic thing, and it doesn't help. Time for another question? Yep. You spoke of doctors. What of those doctors who are more familiar with the situation and they can spot the consequences? Well, look, you're talking about cannabis or just the whole thing in general? No, PTSD. A lot of doctors are familiar. They're more informed. They're more familiar with veterans, for example. Well, as a general rule, if we get out of the military context, if you will, OSI and everything else, there are, it's a known it's a known phenomenon in civilian life, but military people are misunderstood to begin with. So PTSD is not that well known, and that's why we have to talk about it. The Desmond family, for example, Newfoundland, they sought help. And they were turned down. Well, that happens in all provinces because people are not educated. They're ignorant about the situation. They don't have the same understanding. And as a caregiver, we're told, well, what did you bring him here for? He's looking okay. He's doing fine. Why don't you take him home? We go back in our fortress and up goes the drawbridge, and we're stuck in the same situation. Doctors are just not sufficiently familiar with the situation. We medicate every situation in this society because we don't understand. So what do? You dampen the symptoms, and that's it. If he's taking some medical marijuana for a while, you take away the zombie mentality, and he starts to...
Lionel Desmond actually was on Mefloquine on his deployment, and we've proven that he was, the day of his incident where he killed his family, he was actually having a Mefloquine related incident, as described by his sister, who's the last person to see him alive. So just would like that on record. Thanks.
Thank you.
That ends our testimony today. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank all of you for coming today and all that you have done and continue to do for the men and women to serve. So motion to adjourn, Mr. Bertina. All in favor, carried. Thank you.